Welcome to the Connectfulness Practice Podcast. Here, we settle into the murky, tangled, and freaking hard parts of life to restore our relationship with the self so it can ripple out to the people we love, the work we do, and the world around us. If we can't fix what's wrong, then our grandchildren inherit it. In order to fix what's wrong, we have to talk about it, and we can't move that conversation forward if we're not willing to be real about where we are now. We have to push on the edges of what it means to connect. Otherwise, nothing will ever change. I'm your host, Rebecca Wong, and I'm here to guide you through a series of radically honest conversations about what it means to be truly human in all of its messy, beautiful, hilarious, and heartbreaking glory. In our collective effort of looking inward, we're starting to do the outward work to reconnect the world. While these discussions will guide you into the connectfulness practice, this podcast is not meant to be a substitute for the depth of work that you'd encounter with a licensed provider. If something in this episode touches you, reach out. That's where you initiate the ripple that restores relationships. Learn more about my connectfulness counseling practice and my online workshops at connectfulness.com. In today's episode, we're joined by Francesca Maxime, the host of the Rerooted Trauma, Neuroscience, and Social Justice podcast on Ram Dass's Be Here Now network. I want to welcome you all back to today's podcast. And I'm actually here with my husband, James.
Hi.
Hey. And James had a chance to listen to this interview, and it feels different than a lot of my other interviews.
Yes.
And I wanted to bring you in because we are an interracial couple. And I thought it might be helpful for my listeners to orient themselves a little bit before they dig in and listen to this conversation.
So it was a very insightful conversation, but it was very fast-paced with a lot of, for me, jargon I've never heard before. I put it together. I understand what it means, but it was a bit disorienting at first.
So for folks that are listening, that are about to hear this interview, maybe that's just a good thing to know going into it, that the pace of this conversation is a little bit fast.
It's fast and deep at the same time.
Fast and deep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there may be times where maybe they even need to pause and just kind of take something in and figure out what it means to them or how to sit with it
Right.
as they're listening.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I had to pause it a few times to kind of go, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think that in order to listen to this episode, it's important to sit with our discomfort at times and be honest about what we don't know.
Yeah. Not being white, I think that it might be possible that white people may be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
For me being brown, it spoke to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So there wasn't so much discomfort for you. It was more about resonance.
Resonance and some affirming.
Yeah. So stay tuned, and James and I will pop back in at the end of the interview. Francesca, welcome. I'm glad to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to see you, Rebecca, and engage in this conversation about interracial couples and just sort of where we are in this moment and all those kinds of things. But lovely to connect with connectfulness and with you. There are certain considerations at a sort of micro, meso, and macro level around interracial couples that are all pertinent, that may be under maybe like off the radar, like things that you're not really thinking about as being things that are impacting the duo of your partnership or the triad or whatever if you're poly. But, and I think that because of the uprising this summer, because of COVID and the sort of highlighting of health disparities and the way in which certain populations are affected and all these things, I've seen in the folks that I work with that are in interracial partnerships that it's really highlighted some of the ways in which the lived experience of one partner is just not the same as the lived experience of another.
And so what I'm hearing in there is just how much harder it is to understand each other's reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know, no matter who the couple is that's coming in my practice, I'm guessing in yours as well, being able to take in and understand and really listen to each other's reality is a huge piece of what couples have to navigate and what they have to learn how to do.
100%. And the irony is that a lot of couples feel gaslighted, or a partner within a couple feels gaslit by their partner because it's so, and when I say this, whiteness, white supremacy, white body supremacy, white racial advantage. Please know, I'm talking about systems of oppression that have sort of favored and prioritized being in a non-melanated, often cisgendered, heterosexual, male, Christian, English-speaking, born here in the USA, non-immigrant body that is sort of the norm, quote unquote, that we've inherited. So it's sort of just like we inherit a certain kind of way in which everything from our academic institutions and our trainings to the way in which we consider what a marriage should look like, to the way in which we should have and engage in child rearing, to all kinds of things, sexual practices or activities and things like that, that these are all coming from what would be this sort of supremacist. And when I say supremacist, I mean oppressive, meaning that description that I just brought out is to be seen as not only centered or normative or supreme, meaning idealized, but also privileged insofar as that it gets to decide, because this is really all about equity and power anyway, it gets to decide who wins and who loses, who has access and who doesn't. So this system has been constructed that certain groups of people are favored at the expense. This is the part. It's not like favored, like better. It's that I get more because you get less. Mm-hmm. And I get more out of your labor. I get more out of your sacrifice. See, so that's the key critical part. And that plays out in relationships because that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah. And
the way in which, for example, one of my Black clients who's partnered with a white partner will say, I never grew up without anxiety walking down the street. I've seen people, snuffed out. I've seen this and that. I've never walked into a gas station late at night when I go upstate about anything and not, been concerned that something is going to be physically, harmful to me. That's never happened. Whereas, their partner has never even considered what those considerations might be like. How am I dressed right now? Who am I with? Could they be my cover? Meaning, am I safer if I bring this person versus that person? And it's all subtle and unspoken, and much the same way, like, I think a lot of times women do things, at least I speak for myself, to kind of manage situations like underground. But that takes a toll. And so to your point, learning how to understand your partner starts with, from a mindfulness perspective, knowing how much you don't know. And then sort of saying, is that so? Are you sure? And let me check it out and be curious about it.
And so I want to just circle back because there's so much in there. Mm-hmm. When you say slow it down and know what you don't know, one of the big pieces in there that I'm hearing is it's often very hard to know what we don't know. And because there just is this massive system of oppression, part of knowing what we don't know is knowing that we don't know a lot, that we don't know our partner's full experience.
Mm-mm. Yeah, we don't. Well, because I guess really what I want to hammer home is what's been normalized is actually an oppressive system.
Totally.
So I just don't think people get it. They think things are like neutral, but it's not neutral.
No, it's focused on the white heterosexual, male, Protestant Catholic, able, English-speaking person in power.
Right.
And our entire normalized culture, society is built around keeping that person in power.
Yeah. And that's right. And so when we look at, for example, the recent election where 53% of the people who were white women voted for Trump in 2016, and now we saw the numbers tick up to 55, people are like, how did that, what is that about? And the idea there is they're choosing race over gender. They're choosing power and privilege and affinity over, for example, sisterhood, and it's just very interesting because, and I'm, sort of speaking in binary terms right now, but that's not old. I mean, that's not new. That's very old. If you look at people like Catherine Bryant, who was the one who accused Emmett Till, who was 14 when he was murdered for allegedly whistling at her in a store, which she later recanted, meaning that didn't actually happen. But he was violently murdered by this woman's husband, who was later found out to be a domestic abuser, and and his friends, and then let off by an all-white jury. That this whole thing is, she was a mom. She couldn't ally with her momness with this woman who had a 14-year-old son. Yeah. And I think that this is pertinent to partnership and to couplehood, because this idea of prizing what you just said is what's centered in this sort of oppressive system, this normalized oppressive system, is something that I know a lot of nice guys who are just like, white cishet males that are in relationships that just don't know what they don't know, to your point.
Yeah.
And the invitation is, well, there's maybe some classes or some books or things that you just might want to at least start with to be aware of. It's not going to fix it everything, but at least be aware if you're dating folks who are non-white.
Yeah.
Or even if you are.
And I also want to hold space for those who are in interracial and mixed relationships where there is some awareness and still there is some misses in terms of their understanding of each other. There are couples I know of, some in my practice, some outside of my practice, where with this time in politics, with COVID and protests, where often it's the white partner that finds it's really important to be out there protesting, and the partner of color who is struggling more with putting themselves at risk, whether it's in the protest or it's in regards to COVID. And there are some other struggles that are coming up there that couples just have to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime the white partner wants to show up at a protest or do, work about phone banking, and wants to do prison abolition work or something, that's great. Go do it. Like, I'm all for that. Don't expect that your partner who's a partner of color is going to be down with it, because they've already been dealing with microaggressions and all kinds of they've already been navigating and doing heavy lifting around stuff that you don't even see, that grain of grain by sand has created a Sisyphean kind of, sense of burden that is put on, right? It's like a lot of people in this individualistic, Western, rugged individualism, meritocracy, sort of non-collectivist society that we're in, think that we're in some kind of a Victorian novel or something where our romantic partnerships are supposed to be peaceful and non-conflictual, and that we're supposed to have these ideas around we should do stuff together and, whatever. I say no. The partner who's been marginalized is already burdened with this. So you can go and do these things, but don't be performative. Use them as learning experiences and be humble about it. We know that the social determinants of health for, Latinos, Indigenous folks, Black folks are, frontline. You're out there delivering groceries. You're doing all the things that put you in contact with COVID. You're perhaps in smaller, living quarters and stuff like that. Because socioeconomically you were denied home ownership and loans and stuff that were afforded to white people. I mean, there's a reason why these things are the way they are. That, yeah, if you can have agency and you can say, I need to keep my home safe and I don't want to actually like bring this in, then I say, great, do it. If you're the white partner who wants to go out and do the protest and the person of color doesn't want you to go because they want to keep their home safe, then listen to that and stay home and go find another way to be a real ally. I mean, I think that's totally fair and not ridiculous at all.
Yeah. Let's get more in there with the lens. I know both you and I have, we both have studied with Terry Real. We both talk about RLT. We bring that into our work. And so much of the conversation in RLT has a lot to do with grandiosity and shame, better than, less than, inferiority and supremacy. And that is so much a part of what couples navigate in terms of their power dynamics for all couples every day. And for interracial mixed couples, I think this is perhaps something that we just need to really pay more attention to.
Yeah. I mean, Terry talks about overt and covert narcissism and shame being sort of an, shame is sort of a narcissistic position because it leaves no room for anybody else's feelings because you're just spending all your time feeling shitty about yourself. And like, you then just sort of like feel bad about feeling bad, but that keeps you not doing anything, but you feel good about feeling bad. So you justify you're not doing anything. And
I just want to pause you because I don't think I've heard Terry say this piece.
No, he didn't say it. I said it.
You say it. So that shame is a form of narcissism.
I say it's a form of narcissism. Terry doesn't say that. I say that.
It's like my mind is doing this right now as I take that in because I'm having a yes moment. And like you just put into words something that I don't think I've heard before.
Well, that's good.
We hear about grandiosity being narcissistic, but we don't hear about shame also having that.
People love their shame. That's what white fragility is. It keeps me from doing anything. I don't have to be accountable. I can just feel bad about it and I don't have to actually do anything. And then I can complain about when I try to do something, somebody's bitching at me because I didn't do it right, but I tried and I was, it's this whole thing. And it's funny because one of my Black clients is married to a white woman and, he speaks freely about like, my God, the fragility of this woman, like, raised Catholic, raised in this basic, sort of like middle-class, working class background or whatever. And, the idea of the lack of freedom of being able to just sort of like talk freely about sex and sort of what are we supposed to be doing right or not really like, and being 100% down with like, yeah, like I'm down with Black Lives Matter. Like, no, my family does use the N-word, but I'm down with Black Lives Matter. I mean, like that's a lot to hold. But the fragility or the sort of shame, is very narcissistic because it's sort of like, I don't have room for holding space for the totality of my partner's feelings as they're witnessing shared bloodshed on the streets constantly with the Breonna Taylors and George Floyds. And part of that is because with Pope Nicholas and the doctrine of discovery and the ways in which Christian imperialism, gave sanction to all the folks to go basically convert all of the savages and, all of that garbage that white people who are of that Christian, background, regardless. I mean, I was raised in the Catholic Church, often have this idea that it's an individualistic culture. It's me, mine, it's up to me to like make it better. And they're taught shame. They're taught shame as a way of quote unquote doing good. They're taught shame as a way of being helpful. They're, and you see it in the helping professions, therapist professions. It's like, and I'm like, no, that is not the way that collectivist cultures think. Whether it's an Asian culture, an African culture, an African-American culture, they're all in it together. You'll hear people say, what's up, fam? Because they're saying, how are we with this? Whereas the shame is very much like, oh no, I need to kind of get small and not exist. And someone in a more collectivist culture is like, I'm fine here because I got my tribe and I want to expand into that. So it's a whole thing there about shame. Yeah.
I'm also picking up on a whole nother angle in what you're talking about too. And I hear the piece and the power that the shame brings because it keeps the conversation centered on how badly I feel. Mm-hmm. And as you start talking more about this collectivist culture versus this more like individual narcissistic shame-based white fragility, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had almost a year and a half ago now with Resmaa Menakem. And, Resmaa was talking a lot about, in order to live in a more somatic abolitionist way, one of the things we really need to do is create culture. And that's exactly what's missing when we're individualists, when we're living in this me first kind of place, when we're focused on our shame. What we're missing is the culture.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole reason why that is, right? The whole part of it was assimilation. Like you had to give up your culture to be American. So you become American by not being Jewish, by not being Italian, by not being Irish, by not being whatever, because you were smelly or you were stupid or you were whatever. And so you literally shed your clothes, you shed your customs, you shed your language. And then in the case of some folks like the Irish, you're given certain props just by being what they then sort of turned at a certain point, even though you're in the same class of laborers as being white, so that you have the land that other people who are Black don't. You have access, so then you get certain power. So then there's competition. And so like creating culture is something that you can take a class called whiteawake.org, whiteawake.org. And the class is called Before We Were White. And so you take that class and you go on a journey where you figure out, where am I from? What did I lose? What did we used to do? What are we not able to do? Nobody grew up with Wonder Bread. Nobody grew up with Skippy peanut butter. This is not where we come from. And now we have this like, I need to spend my $50 on one jar of organic honey or something. Well, that's garbage also, because it just feeds into the neoliberal capitalistic, framework of, monetizing well-being. So this idea of culture, if you read a book called Behind the Veil, behind the White Veil, I think it's called. And the guy who wrote it is the co-founder of the Center for the Study of White American Culture. He and his wife, who's Black, and a few other people
I
run
had one
that.
of their teachers on a while ago. Robin Alprin came on.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, lifting the white veil, that's what it's called. And he talks about white pride that isn't white supremacist pride, not like neo-Nazi crazy pride. White pride, like, to Resmaa's point, like, what are the things that we've done well, like regardless, like ethically and with integrity and like, ways in which we've connected. And sure, it's okay to like have a sense of pride there. Like you don't have to be ashamed of everything all the time, but also go back to your history and try to incorporate, like your rituals, like your music, your food or whatever it is. And because otherwise you're going to find yourself like doing a spiritually bypassing situation. We are culturally appropriating someone else, which happens in this wellness space of super yoga, super mindfulness, super shamanistic ayahuasca people that, I mean, yeah, okay. But also, did you ask permission? Did they give it to you? Are you aligning yourself with that lineage in a deeper way, or are you sort of appropriative with it? So,
yeah, there's just so much in there to wrap our heads around. And I think this is where I just keep coming back to this, knowing what it means to know what you don't know. And it's all about the many layers that, for many of us, we don't hold in mind, we don't even have knowledge of within our bodies. And yet it's there on many different levels, that it's living inside of us and with us and in our relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm a mindfulness teacher. So the basic Buddhist path is sort of like clear seeing. So the whole point is, the way out of suffering is you acknowledge the suffering. The suffering is old age, sickness, and death. The three poisons are ignorance, craving, and what is it? Greed, hatred, and delusion. And so you're really sort of looking at how do we walk our way out of this? And I think the first thing is just naming that what we've considered normative is actually oppressive. It's not an equity-based structure. And if we're in a white body, even if we became white, meaning even if we're Jewish, even if we're Irish, even if we're Italian, even if we're whatever, even if we assimilated because we are able to, because our melanin levels were such that was possible, possible, right? That we benefit in a way in the system that is based on, advantage, based on less melanin, that is just completely constructed. There's no genetic basis. We're 99.9% the same DNA. I mean, that's shown across the board. And that when we start naming that, and we start naming things like, okay, so then that means that if what's normative has been oppressive, then it's fair to say that, in fact, we live in a society that is inherently constructed to be racist, because race was used in service to capitalism and extraction and the oppression. That's why this all started. It was about money. It was about greed. So to use the Buddhist teaching of the basic fundamental problem is greed, and, sort of wanting more and more and more, whether it's more pride, like the grandiosity, people you see in relationships, like back to Terry Real, get addicted to their grandiosity, whether it's shame, you can get addicted to your shame, and then you become, white silence is violence, and you don't engage with actually doing the work of being a good ally, or whether it's actually money and extraction and, oppression and stuff like that. So how do we build a more equitable partnership, which is, to use Terry's term, full respect living? How do we live in a more full respect living world? That's the whole point. How do we create and build that? We already belong to one another. How do we embody that?
Right. So we belong to one another. We want to focus on embodying that. And this is where my work, I keep always coming back to keeping the whole context of the world that we're living in mind, and focusing on the couple, because this is where I think we have the most influence. Might not be the only place we have influence. And if we can pay attention to what's happening inside that ecosystem that we live in every day, that we breathe into, the person that we wake up next to, the person that we eat our meals with, if we can shift and clean up and make less toxic the space between us, then I believe that has a really profound and big impact on how we also walk out into the rest of the world.
100%. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples from cases of mine, like, that may be shedding light on some of this. One of my, there's a situation where there's, a Black partner and a white partner, and they're in upstate, New York, and, one would not go into the gas station, to return the moving van or whatever it is, at the parking lot without the white partner, because doing so, because there was like a cop car at the coffee shop around the corner or whatever. And it would have been more one of those ideas of like, well, what are you doing here? Or why are you here? Or who are you with? Or what do you, and that could go bad very quickly. And that lives in this person's body. And so they have to be very careful about that. Another one is, was a birthday party. It's COVID. Everybody wants to go and do something for their birthday. Okay, well, let's take a trip with our partner down to, South Carolina or North Carolina or Florida. I forget where it was. Let's take a drive, since we're not going to fly. And so then it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? Like, what's my plan? Like, how am I going to navigate that? If we're driving, what happens if we get pulled over? And we went through a safety plan, like the way you would with domestic violence victims, around like, well, what happens when, who knows that you're on this trip? Who's keeping track of you? Like, what are the people that you can call? Like, if you do get pulled over, if you're a Black partner in that car, going down there, what does your partner know about what to do in that situation? Are they going to freak out? Are they going to pull out their cell phone? What's the limit? Play out all the different scenarios. If a cop pulls you over and pulls out his gun or asks for this or that, how can you prevent it from happening? By putting certain things in place. I mean, and at the end of the day, I said, you know what? You may or may not want to take this trip right now, because to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know that I can't guarantee that you can make that trip safe for you. And they ended up not taking that trip. And then more subtly, like, people will just sort of go through the day-to-day around something like, for example, another scenario was a client was at a wedding with a bunch of white people, because the person that they're married to is white. And one of the off-duty cops, who was a guest at the reception, came back with drinks from the bar, and he had been drinking, and offered to give someone some, and I say this because this is what they said, nigger juice. Mm-hmm. And so, like, then that was somehow something that was not shared with the client, not shared with what was going on in their life around their partnership and held because of shame. And then the client finding out later is like, what are you talking about? Like, I need to know this. Like, are these the people that you're associating with? Like, what, like, how are you feeling about that? Did you not think that it would matter to me? Like, me not being aware of this means that something could have been terribly wrong. Something could have gone terribly wrong. So these are like real lived experiences. And then how they're responded to was, you know, like a rupture and repair. Like, let's have that conversation. Let's have the conversation about what this means to me. Or in the other cases, let's have a conversation with a couples therapist to deal with the racial conflict around you're not getting my lived experience, someone who's schooled in that. So they're real examples.
And something that you shared with me before we started recording was also that it's not always about how you, the couple, sees yourselves, but it's also about how the outside world sees you.
Anyone who's not in the center of the positionality chart that's going to be in the show notes, if you're not in the center of that, the world is looking at you in ways that you don't consent to.
Right. So let's just name for our listeners what's in the center of that chart. In the center of the chart, we have white, male, ruling or wealthy class, US born, English speaking, native language, able-bodied, Protestant, Catholic, heterosexual. And everybody else is moving further outside of that center.
Right. I mean, people are just themselves. But the fact that that's what's centered is what's messed up. It shouldn't be a circle that has a center with that in it in the first place. So if you take that class, Building a Multiracial Society from the Center for White American Culture, they'll talk about what it takes to build a multiracial society and how you can respect differences in unique ethnic groups and things like that, how there can be some overlap. Obviously, there's going to be when it comes to people like me as a Haitian, Dominican, Italian American woman. So I have mixed ethnic, background. I don't identify as a racial. I know I've been racialized, but I don't, I'm a person with a lot of lighter white skin privilege who lives in a world that favors whiteness that is of mixed ethnicity and what they would call mixed race. And I don't like to call myself mixed race because race is a construct to begin with, but I get it. And I get that that's how people define me. And I will go along with what they mean by that. And I'm not denying anything about that. And I say, sure, I'm a woman of color. But I also have a lot of light skin racial advantage, and that has afforded me a lot of privilege and ignorance for 40 years. And I only started doing this work a few years ago. So even though I'm mixed, even though I'm sort of the epitome of what we're talking about, the offspring, the progeny of the couples that we're talking about, this was not discussed in my household at all. And it's work that I had to dig into and lean into. So the whole thing about couples and parenting, I think, is also super important, because the more that the person who's in the center that you just mentioned, even if they're a white woman, they're still more centered in many ways. The more that they do work on, exploring and understanding sort of the history, the more that they're going to be able to show up in a way with their kids that's actually dealing with the realities of what's out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as someone who is in an interracial marriage, raising children who are also, they have light melanated skin, but they are not white. And being aware of their experience in the world, of my husband's experience, my children's experience, is something that it takes a lot of work for me on a daily basis, because I don't see the world. I don't experience the world. People don't treat me the way that they are treated.
Yeah. I think that's the whole thing. I don't get to consent to the way other people see me or view me. You can do the same exact thing and just be in a body that looks a little bit different, and you get treated a completely different way. And that's seen from like the way in which people give you coffee or don't, or cut in line at Starbucks or not, or the way in which somebody takes your order or doesn't at a dinner table. I mean, it shows up in so many ways. And for you,
and it has interesting flips sometimes, right? Like my husband and I noticed that there are certain places in our community where he gets treated a certain way, and I'm more in that center of privilege. And there are other places where, because he's a man and I'm a woman, that center of privilege flips. And so it's just, there are times we'll use it to our advantage and we'll notice it and we'll know in this place, if you take the lead here, we're going to do better. And in this place, if I take the lead, we're going to do better. And so those are conversations that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think being strategic in the face of understanding and really knowing that like we're in a shitty system that's fundamentally not really equitable, and then being strategic about how to work optimally as a partnership within that system is just a really like, let's get real kind of awareness where like we're on the same team and we're going to have to do this, even though we don't co-sign and rubber stamp the way that this is the system we're in. It's a shitty system.
It's a shitty
but
system.
Like we're going to figure out how to best navigate it for now, and then do whatever work we do beyond that to kind of uproot it and change it at a foundational level, but be strategic.
I want to come back to talking about that capacity that the couple really, to be healthy, nurtures within themselves, to live in that reality of understanding each other's experience in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to really understand your own experience in the world first. And Black people understand their own experience. White people don't understand their own experience. And that's why,
Can we pause there?
Yeah,
because I don't want to pass over that. I think that's too big to pass over. And this is, I think, one of the really important pieces here is that a lot of white people do not understand their experience in the world. And that is a privilege that they haven't even had to notice. And it's also part of white supremacy. And it's also part of how the white body supremacy systemically has invaded all of us, that it has an impact on all of our bodies. It's not just people of color that are impacted by this. White people are also impacted in a different way.
Yeah. Neuroses, anxiety, depression.
Not knowing themselves.
Shame, numbness.
Dissociation.
Yeah, all of that. I mean, 100%. It's not fun to be you. You think it is, but it's not, because you have to you can't let your guard down for 2 seconds because somebody else is going to take your place, because that's what happens in a patriarchal, hierarchical, oppressive sort of system. So, we don't just get to be us there either. Somebody else has a smaller tush or a bigger boobs or a blonder hair if you're a girl, or somebody, whatever. So that idea of, it's called dual consciousness, what W.B. Du Bois talked about a long time ago. Like, for every person who's marginalized, they're living in two worlds. One, my world that I know and understand, my lived experience. And two, the world I need to navigate, the world of whiteness, where certain things are prized and privileged and other things are not. And how do I navigate that? And that's what people don't get. When you go into graduate school and you sit there and you're talking to some teachers and administrators about stuff, and they're trying to set you up for something that they say is neutral about what's polite, what's proper, or what's the way in which you do X or Y or Z, or they have no idea that your actual lived experience, honoring who you are, is completely anathema to the system, in this case, at the meso level, the university, that has been set up through the whiteness oppressive lens, that then you are not down with, and that there could be another way. Now, we have normalized this to such an extent that it has infiltrated our trainings. It has infiltrated our therapy. Freud didn't invent any of this relational this is just a way of talking about stuff that Indigenous folks and, collectivist cultures have been doing in many other ways for a long time. When Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma therapist, talks about doing yoga as a good therapy for trauma, I mean, of course, but also is dancing and singing and bouncing around and, doing all the kinds of things that in Western white assimilated culture, you were programmed and told not to do and shamed for doing.
Yeah.
So we are not a well society. We are culturally, somatically, a dissociative, what we would call avoidant or dismissive society. And we want to move to secure attachment culturally. We don't want to be, that's living relationally. That's living with integrity. That's full respect living. This is otherwise defense, fear, contraction, functional adult, to use Terry Reel's language around the idea of being the angry teenager. Or if you're on the female side, oftentimes dipping into the wounded child with shame. No, this whole business of embodied anti-racism, or waking up to the world, being able to see your partner's experience, putting yourself in their shoes, having the compassion and empathy for their experience, being very clear about what you don't know and haven't lived, and also doing the work to be honest about leaning in and studying it and getting curious about it and asking them about their experience and how it's different from yours. That's how we grow as a society, and we earn secure attachment culturally.
So where do you suggest that folks begin? Because there's so much work ahead in terms of reconnecting, in terms of waking up, in terms of bringing more consciousness and compassion into their experience. Where do you suggest that folks begin? What is the entry point for people who maybe haven't done this work?
Well, if you're partnered with someone who's a person of color, just take stock and just say, I've been ignorant, I've been privileged, I've been advantaged, I haven't known it, I've been living under a whole set of assumptions that are just not true. And, I'm starting to wipe the lens clean. And when I actually look at the landscape, there's a lot more crap out there than I was aware of before, and I think just sort of sit with that. Most people who sort of start to like take in the realities of just what they saw this summer, in terms of the killings, the modern day lynchings, I think sitting with that in a way that isn't like that I need to go away into a shame place, or go away into a place of like, oh, well, that's, I need to be privileged. I think that's number one. So distress tolerance and comfort is real. Distress tolerance and discomfort tolerance is really important. And that has to do with nervous system regulation. That has to do with being able to understand how to regulate your nervous system. So if you want to work with someone like me or someone else who does somatic work and trauma stuff to kind of get in touch with how to do that, that's number one. Number two is there's nothing wrong with you. Nobody's saying because you're a white person, you're a bad person. Nobody's saying that, that doesn't go together. We're saying the system is bad and it has affected you also, although differently than someone in a, Black body. It has affected you also to your detriment. What looks like privilege or feels like rest or whatever isn't so much. And so kind of naming and knowing that. And then from that place, like, there's nothing wrong with me. Okay, I noticed that I go into the shame place. I noticed that I still feel, unworthy. Well, then we go back to RLT. We go back to positive self-esteem, healthy self-regard. I'm enough and I matter. I'm no better or worse than anyone else. We reconnect with ourselves first. We maybe do a little bit of the pieces around like, what is all the crap that I feel crappy about? And this is what kills me about whiteness. Everybody has all these little individual things like, oh, well, if my father wasn't an alcoholic, if he really loved me, if I was able to fix this, then he wouldn't have beat me up. If I had kept my parents together, I never really, had any self-confidence because my brother was the one who got the attention because they were the straight A student and I was the goofball. What do you think that really is about? That's whiteness. That's not about your family. That's about whiteness as it plays out in your family. So it's the big system that has been screwing you over and making you feel like a piece of crap forever. So know that. And then you can say, okay, to your partner, I've just sort of taken stock of all of this stuff. I want to know more about your experience in the world, how it's different from mine. I'm open and curious. I'm reading some books. I'm taking some classes. I'm learning a little bit more about this whole charade. It's like the Wizard of Oz, this whole thing that we've been living in, pulling back the curtain. And I want to hear from you. And I want to listen to understand, again, to use an RLT thing, not to speak and defend and blame or say whatever it is. I really want to understand your experience. And I want to be a safe place. I want to be a soft, welcoming, warm harbor for you to feel as though you can talk to me about any issues and any things that you might be bumping up into about microaggressions, about slights at work, about things that wouldn't happen to me because I'm not in your body, but that I want to hear about because you matter to me. And if you're in pain, that matters to me. And if you want a list of the classes and books and stuff like that, you can go to my website under maximeclarity.com/resources, or you can take the class that I just offered through Therapy Wisdom called Embodied Anti-Racism, because even though the live calls just ended in November. The class is up and you can watch all of the recordings, and you can still get the CEU credits and things like that if you're a therapist. Because I go over all of this stuff. You got to do some of the work inside and then go outside, but stay centered and connected to yourself so that you can actually genuinely be centered when you connect with others.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Francine.
Yeah, I tend to do the inside out thing.
I think it's beautiful and so needed in this world, in this time right now.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, Rebecca. This is an important topic, and I hope that anybody who wants to do any more work on it, feel free to reach out to me. I also do case consultations and things like that.
And you also have your own podcast.
That's true. It's called Rerooted, REROOTED, on Ram Dass's Be Here Now network. And I do talk to a lot of folks about this stuff, like Resmaa Menakem, like Janet Helms, who did the summary stages of racial identity development. And she talks about how being non-racist is insufficient and why being anti-racist is kind of more where we come to. And then, of course, yes, we're all one in this non-dual unity way that everybody's asking for now post-election, but that we don't want to spiritually bypass. And so there's a lot there on the podcast that would be rich for people about this. Not so much about couples, but about the macro issues that are out there.
Totally. Thank you again. I really appreciate being able to bring this to the listeners.
Me too. Thanks, Rebecca. Take good care.
You too.
Hey, honey.
Hey, baby.
We've never done this before.
No, we haven't.
So this is new. I wanted to bring you in to just kind of, you've just listened to this episode.
I did.
What's come up for you?
Your conversation with Francesca was... it was insightful. For me, I heard a lot of things that sounded familiar. I heard a few things that were also a bit of confirmation in my own gut feelings about certain things in the world, or how certain people adopt people's other cultures or parts of their culture for themselves. I have feelings on that. There's a lot of moments of recognition for myself being brown. It did conjure up memories of being, in situations where I wasn't comfortable, where I had to kind of play in a certain way just to make sure nothing was going to happen.
What I'm also hearing is that in an embodied way, a lot of what you were hearing really made sense to you, like in a lived experience.
Yeah, a lived experience. Correct.
Yeah. What strikes me is that these conversations are not part of our everyday between us. Like, we don't have these conversations all the time.
No, not at all. I mean, we don't look at each other and we don't think about each other's race. Sometimes we think about each other's culture.
I'm really curious if you'd share, what is it like for you to be in an interracial marriage with me?
For me, I don't really think of it as an interracial marriage. We have mixed children, and that's pretty obvious. And there are moments in our lives, those differences of, I won't say race, but culture, bumped, clashed, they conflicted at times, or there was certain ignorance on one side or another, and it became kind of a bump in the road that we needed to kind of figure out. Other than that,
it's not something you think about that much.
It's not something I think about at all. Really.
Do you think it's something that I think about more than you?
I do think you think about it more than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does that feel like?
I find it in my mind, my gut, my knee-jerk reaction is, what are you worrying about? Mm-hmm. That's my knee-jerk reaction. We are who we are. And that's not going to stop us from being, us as a family, as a man and wife, as lovers, it's not going to stop it.
Do you ever think about how other people see us? Like, do you ever think about how the world sees us from the outside? Not how you and I see our marriage, like not what it feels like inside of our partnership, but do you ever think about how other people look at us or see us? Does that ever impact you?
Very rarely do I ever think about that.
What about with all the anti-Asian hate lately?
That has entered my mind a few times. I am certainly a little bit more on guard lately.
What do you think for folks that are listening to this episode? What would you want people to be thinking about as they take this information home with them?
I think the root of it all is that we are all just people, and we should just be treating each other like people.
Thanks for joining me, honey.
You're welcome.
So that wraps up today's episode. You can learn more about my Connectfulness counseling practice and my online workshops at connectfulness.com. I want to express my deep gratitude for Sarah and Chris Ferris, the musicians behind the beautiful soundtrack for the Connectfulness Practice podcast, which they recorded and mixed at Kidney Stone Studio. This podcast is produced by me, Rebecca Wong, and copyrighted by Connectfulness Counseling. Stay tuned for another episode next month. Take good care.